In October of 2011, everyone who walked out of a memorial service in Palo Alto was handed a small box. Inside was a book, not a book about computers, a book about a yogi, written in 1946, that the man they were burying had reread almost every year of his adult life. He left instructions that every person there get a copy. A lot of them had been screamed at by him, but most of them he loved very deeply. This is becoming Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs was an asshole. Why though? Because he loved Apple. Steve Jobs was a deep and true friend to a handful of people. But why? Because he loved Apple. Steve Jobs put his eyes on the simplest of things. But why? Because he loved Apple. The book for today's podcast is called Becoming Steve Jobs, and it was written by Brent, Schlender, and Rick Tetzeli. And right away, let's dive in. The first paragraph that I'm going to read here, I believe this matters the most. If you look at true artists, if they get really good at something, it occurs to them that they can do this for the rest of their lives. And they can be really successful at it to the outside world, but not really successful to themselves. That's the moment that an artist really decides who he or she is. If they keep on risking failure, they're still artists. Dylan and Picasso were always risking failure. This Apple thing, this is the way for me. I don't want to fail, of course. And I finally decided I don't really care. This is what I want to do. And if I try my best and fail, well, I tried my best. In this particular section of the book, Steve Jobs is telling the author about his path back to Apple after he had been fired the first time around and found his way back into the company after almost a dozen years away. From the very beginning of the company when it was founded in 1976 until the very day he died, Steve Jobs loved Apple. His longtime friend and talented movie director John Lasseter puts it very clearly for us. He loved Apple, says Johnny Lasseter. I mean, he loved Apple the whole time. It was painful for him to watch what was happening to it. Indeed, the reason Steve had held on to one share of Apple stock for the previous decade was to be able to keep getting shareholder information materials and, if the spirit moved him, to be able to attend the annual shareholders meeting. As we always say on the show, when you're following what you love in life and in business, the risks are not really risk. Steve knew this, and he took crazy risk because he loved Apple. In the very beginning, he had quick success with the first computer they developed, the Apple I. This planted the seeds of love very deeply inside of Steve. He saw a Picasso, a Dylan, in each single machine that he made. His deep drive, it just spills over into the company, into everything that he touches. But it takes a really long time, over 20 years, for Steve Jobs to learn how to become Steve Jobs, the beautiful artist at the intersection of art and technology. The title of the book, Becoming Steve Jobs, it does an excellent job following his life, all of the ups, the downs, the good and the bad. It doesn't leave anything behind, and it really takes you on a roller coaster of emotions. There's actually a few times when I was reading this book that I wanted to put it down and not read anymore because I was embarrassed by all of the failures that Steve had, one after another. And it kind of just pisses you off a little bit because you know what he was in those last years of life. It's really a big dose of reality about what it took to become that man. And I have to say, I've listened to probably at least 20 podcasts on Steve Jobs, and I think most of them do a really good job of covering various aspects of his life, and some take us through the whole spectrum. But if you really want to know him on a deeper level, I highly, highly recommend this book. It really gets you into the weeds on who Steve Jobs was and what it took to become Steve Jobs. The author, he had a 25-year relationship with Steve. And for all of the details, I would certainly recommend picking up the book. So my goal here today is to cover the simple and deep lessons that drove Steve so that we can think about them and how that we could possibly apply them to our lives or our businesses. Or in some cases, how we can take the mistakes that Steve Jobs made along the way and avoid those. Because those are just as important as any lesson that we can learn and apply to the business. Looking at those mistakes so that we can avoid them, those are critical. And right away, one maxim that I love and I want to call out here because this is going to come up many times throughout the show. It comes from Joe Colomb, who was the founder of Trader Joe's, who you and I studied on episode 3. And he says the following: the dots are there, but they're usually hidden. Steve, he's an absolute master of seeing the dots way, way, way in advance of almost anybody else, especially early in business. He sees dots that are like 20 years in the future, but what he does is he tries to force them down people's throats too early. And I watched a speech that he gave in 1983 at the Aspen Institute. And Steve, he said something radical. And let me just paraphrase what he said here. He says that he really loves books because knowledge is transferred directly from the person who wrote the book, such as Aristotle or Plato, directly to him, or it's the same for us. The works come directly from the author to us. There's no teacher in the middle. It's just a direct transfer. That statement alone is powerful because books really are like time machines. Steve, he goes on to say, but we can't ask Aristotle a question. Now the payoff here. He says that one day if the next great Aristotle could carry around a little machine in his pocket where he could type in all of his interactions and everything that he was doing for his entire life, then when he was dead and gone, we could just go ask questions and gain a deeper view from them. And remember, we're in 1983 here. 22 years later, not long before Steve's death, he's going to found Apple University. This is intended to help employees think like Steve. So this grand way of seeing future dots early on, it leads him into a lot of tension between people because he doesn't believe that he's getting the best out of them. He's always trying to force these dots upon people, force his vision upon people. And while that's good as a leader to share your vision, you have to do it in the proper way. You can't always force it upon people. For you and I believe we can find the dots by reading and watching our customers, noticing odd little changes, and staying open to the world around us. The dots are always there. They're just hidden. As Steve's love for Apple grows deeper and deeper, especially in those final years before his death, the dots that he connects in one single year would have taken a younger Steve 5 or 10 years to reach. A few points before we jump into the show. First, the episode is not intended to be a book review or a critique. It would take several episodes to fully cover all of the details, and at that point, I would say just go read the book. And I do highly encourage you to pick up the book. For me, most days it was a really hard book to put down. Like I mentioned earlier, there were ups and downs in the book, but overall, looking at it, it was hard to put down, and I'll absolutely read this book again at least 2 or 3 more times. The goal of the show here is really to look at those major lessons from Steve Jobs so that we can think about how to apply those in our business and our lives, or not apply them, because there's a lot of lessons that we learn here that we would not want to apply to our businesses, and those are critical and important for us to understand. And Steve, like most humans, he makes a lot of mistakes along the way. What not to do, it's just as valuable. And like the afternoon sun shining bright in the sky, they're on full display in this book. With that, let's dive in. We're going to go all the way back to when Steve was just 5 years old. His parents, they moved to Mountain View, California. And his parents, they're working class. His father, Paul Jobs, he holds many different types of jobs. He works as a repo man, he's a machinist, he's a car mechanic, but he creates that very first dot in the story for Steve. He was at heart an inveterate thinker and craftsman who made furniture or rebuilt cars most weekends and taught his son the paramount value of taking one's time, paying attention to the details. And one key word there is inveterate, which is a long established and unlikely to change habit. Follow that with the word craftsman. Then you mix in a young Steve Jobs here. Steve, who was smart, he skipped 6th grade, and his teacher even considered having him skip 2 grades. One thing that we see a lot on the show here with young founders and entrepreneurs is that more is caught than taught from their parents. In this case, Steve, he is blessed with 2 loving and nourishing parents. Steve and Paul Jobs felt deeply entitled from the start, thanks to his parents who raised him to think that he was every bit as special as they believed he could be. At the age of just 5 or 6, his father doesn't treat him like a kid. And just check this out. One afternoon out in the garage, his father, he has a workbench. And what does he do? He clears a section of that workbench and he calls Steve over and he says the following. Steve, this is your workbench now. He gave me some smaller tools and showed me how to use a hammer and a saw and how to build things. He spent a lot of time with me, teaching me how to build things, how to take things apart, put things back together. A whip-smart Steve soaks everything up. Years later, he tells the author that it was just as important to focus on the underside of a computer as it was the outside of a computer. For example, working with care and precision on the brake pads of a Chevy Impala carried the same weight as working on the paint job. It says in the book that Steve, he gives his father a lot of credit for instilling this own sense of aesthetic excellence in the medium that he's working on. And the medium, of course, was digital electronics for Steve. And what Steve was learning from his father in the early 60s, we now hold in our hands today with the iPhone, the iPad, and MacBooks, along with various other Apple products. From the workbench into Steve passes this deep belief that he could really build anything. At the age of 14, he joins what is called the Explorers Club at Hewlett-Packard in Palo Alto. And he's working on electronics and he's learning from HP engineers. Well, one day, Steve, he comes to a point where he needs some parts that are really hard to find. So what does he do? He looks up Bill Hewlett, one of the founders of HP, in the phone book, and I just really love this approach and how bold he was. He looks him up in the phone book and he just gives him a call at home. Bill, he answers the phone, and Steve, he could already spin an excellent tale. He lays out his case. In the result here, he got the part that he needed. Later on in life, Steve would use this as a superpower, and he says the following: most people never pick up the phone and call. Most people never ask. And that's what separates, sometimes, the people that do things from the people that just dream about them. You gotta act. That is 100% correct. You gotta act, and we have to be willing to ask. Plain and simple here. Who do you need to call today? Pick up the phone and make it happen. Steve, at this really young age, already knows that using the right words and the right stories is going to open gates for him and get him exactly what he wants. Those words will become much more harsh later on in life. And if we jump forward to 1969, we get to see the first great chapter here. Steve, he's introduced to Steve Wozniak. In the book, it says the following: Woz was an engineering genius. He had immersed himself deeply into the subject, in school and out. He had even created a rudimentary calculator made of transistors, resistors, and diodes. To put it bluntly, Steve, he doesn't have Woz level engineering skills. Not even close. What he does have is charm and vision of what something can be. He did have a native hunger to put really cool stuff into the hands of as many people as possible. From the start, he had a natural inclination to be an impresario, to convince people to pursue a goal that often only he could see, and then to coordinate and push them towards the creation of that goal. That right there is founder greatness, plain and simple. See the goal and push others towards that goal. 100% the heart and soul of every person that you and I study on this show. And it really reminds me a lot of a young Jay Gould when he was the same age. Jay, he learns surveying. He goes out and works for a deadbeat map maker, but that doesn't last very long because he starts his own little business selling noon marks. He takes over that map making business from his boss, and he uses those skills for the rest of his life to help him develop the railroads. And we talk a lot about Jay Gould on episode 4 and 34 if you'd like to learn a little bit more about Jay. Now, if we go back to Steve here, what is his first big goal? Well, I'm going to tell you that this really makes me smile. It's raw and it's pure and it's entrepreneurial genius at its very core. This is the beginning. Steve and Woz, they learn about what is called a blue box. And this was a little small machine that could mimic the tones that are made by telephones. Now, in 1972, when you wanted to call someone, either from your home, you had long distance. And when you made that call, you had to pay the phone company for that call. Or a lot of people might go to a payphone. So you'd pick up the payphone, you'd have to put a dime or a quarter into it. And that gave you so many minutes on what you could talk to someone on the telephone. Well, this little blue box would speak into the telephone in telephone terms. So it would mimic all the touch tones, and it would tell the telephone company that it had received a quarter, go ahead and make this call. So basically you could make a call for free. So Steve, he can see all the dots here and he knows that this is something that people would want. So what does he do? He pushes Woz to make their own version of the blue box. And Woz, he really believes that they're just making one for themselves to mess around with. Steve, he's got other ideas here. Steve, however, proposed that they try to make some money by selling completely assembled machines. So while Woz polished his circuit designs, Steve pulled together the necessary materials and priced the finished boxes. He and Woz netted some $6,000 selling illegal devices at $150 a pop. Most of these devices are going to be sold to college students who are really desperate to make free calls either to their families, their friends, and a lot of them probably their newfound lovers. It says in the book that the business comes to a crashing halt one day when they're held up at gunpoint. Yet, Steve, he marches on with life. He graduates from high school. He leaves his parents and heads for Reed College in Portland, Oregon. Passengers with him on this journey are the internal seeds that are growing inside of him. Those contain the counterculture in his quest for deeper truth of the world and his place in it. The words of Bob Dylan and the Beatles and the Grateful Dead ring in his ears every single day. While the readings of spiritual masters like Ram Dass and Paramahansa Yogananda guide a lot of his thinking here, as the author describes so well. The messages were clear. Question everything, especially authority. Experiment. Hit the road. Be fearless and work to create a better world. And I got to tell you, that really gives me chills when I read that. And here's why. Later in life, Steve Jobs says that one of his heroes was Edwin Land, who was the inventor of Polaroid. And he actually got to meet Land a couple of times. And I was really curious who Land's hero was. And it was Michael Faraday, who is described as one of the most influential experimentalists in history. So I kept asking the question, who was the hero of Faraday? Well, it was Humphrey Davy, who was a self-taught English chemist who discovered the elements such as sodium and potassium and so many other elements that are on the higher end of the chart. Now, who was Davy's hero? Well, it was Antoine Lavoisier. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but he was the father of modern chemistry. He named oxygen and hydrogen, for example, in a lot of those first elements on the chart. The hero of Lavoisier was Etienne Condillac. Condillac was a French philosopher whose writing on logic and clear reasoning strongly shaped Lavoisier's devotion and passion for chemistry. Who was Condillac's hero? Well, it was John Locke, who was the father of liberalism and argued that the mind begins as a blank slate and it's shaped by our experiences around us. Then who was Locke's hero? It was Robert Boyle, who was the father of modern chemistry and championed rigorous experimental methods over mysticism. And then the last chain in the link, the hero of Boyle was Francis Bacon. And this is the reason I have goosebumps and went on this long tangent here. Just listen to this. Invented the modern idea that theories should be built up from observed data rather than handed down from authority. That is the very start of the empirical scientific method. And we're in the early 1600s. Hero to hero, ideas pass like genetics. We have to look for our heroes and mentors in business. Every single episode of Deeply Driven covers a hero that we can learn from and look up to. And the lessons, they're endless. 400 years I just went through right there. Francis Bacon, he has no idea that his actions would have such a heavy hitting impact on the world, moving from one great thinker and finally into Steve Jobs. We never know where our thinking and our ideas originate from. They morph and they change, and it really is our job to look for the hidden dots. They're all there, they're just hidden. And if we look one hero back, it has a big impact in our life. And it's a lesson that we can learn to study the heroes of your heroes and their heroes. It really fires me up. I listen to a lot of podcasts, at least one podcast on each one of those heroes that I mentioned. And I want to dive in more on this. I'm thinking about making an episode tracing this out a little further. It just really fascinates me. And for Jobs, what does he do? He studies his heroes and he copies their styles. Everything from their style of speaking to their stage setup to their keynote speeches. His mind is really fixed on those that discover the idea of simplicity through beautiful products, art, and language. Steve really loves simplicity. Now, if we hop back to his younger years here, he had just set off to Reed College, and he's got all those thoughts in his mind. He has a really strong mind. He's whip smart, as we said earlier. And his time here, it's going to be really brief. It didn't take long before the headstrong freshman was only attending the classes that fascinated him. And after just one semester, he abruptly dropped out without even telling his parents. He spent a second semester auditing classes, including one calligraphy course that he would cite in later years as the inspiration for the Macintosh's ability to produce a diverse panoply of topographical fonts. He also delved more deeply into Asian philosophy and mysticism and dropped acid with greater frequency, at times almost as a spiritual sacrament. It goes on to say in the book that Steve, he did feel really guilty for wasting his parents' money, taking classes that couldn't really hold his interests, so he drops out. And I really admire how at a young age he drops in on classes, learning things that could catch and hold his mind. And for the rest of his life, this is exactly what he does. Steve, he's an autodidact, which is someone who loves learning for the sake of learning, and he just never stops. This is how I see podcast is dropping in on classes. We can learn basically anything that you're interested in. If you love history, there's thousands of history podcasts. If you love crime podcasts, those are unlimited. News, sports, anything that you want to learn about is available for free. It's an amazing medium that we have right at our fingertips. So for Steve, after he finishes that second semester of sleeping on friends' couches and walking around campus dirty and barefoot, he returns to his parents' home, flat, broke. After a while, he does land a job working as a technician at Atari. And it doesn't take long before the smooth talking jobs, he convinces Atari founder Nolan Bushnell to send him off to Germany to work on and fix coin-operated machines. But that was just a cover story. The deeper reason is that he wanted to use it as a means to get to and visit India. And what exactly is Steve searching for? It's really hard to tell exactly from the book. Steve, he was really hoping to meet a famous guru by the name of Maji, but he had died shortly before Steve arrived. But needless to say, the inputs from this time in India, they do have a profound impact for the rest of his life. And there's a few key elements that I wanted to pull from the book here and share with you. Steve's time in India was splintered, as unfocused as the searches of many young people seeking a broader vision than the one they were handed as children. He wore flowing cotton robes, ate strange foods, and had his head shaved by a mysterious guru. He got dysentery. And I see this simply as Steve going with the flow of life. And what drops in? For the first time, he read Yogananda's Autobiography of a Yogi, a book that he would return to several times throughout his life. And we mentioned this book on a previous podcast. It was episode 23, when we spoke about Mickey Singer, who at this young age surrendered to the flow of life. Yogananda changes Mickey's life, and this book served as his spiritual guide for him, and it does the same thing for Steve Jobs. And thanks to Mickey Singer and his book Untethered Soul, I heard about Autobiography of a Yogi for the first time, and I listened to the audiobook a few years ago. It's very deep. In fact, for me, I would say that I need to listen to it a couple of more times to start trying to break down some of the concepts that are in that book. It's not something that you can just read one time and grasp. It's very deep, and there's a lot of things in there that you really have to stop, think about. And one key understanding that I really did take away is using meditation to calm the mind so that it can perceive clearly. In Jobs, he uses meditation for his entire life to cut through noise. And this really leads him into the world of simplicity that is at the core of Apple's design principle. Simplicity, it's really the ultimate sophistication. Steve returns to the book almost yearly, as the author tells us the following. Buddhism made him feel justified in constantly demanding nothing less than what he deemed to be perfection from others, from the products he would create, and from himself. He would never see a limit to possibilities, a perfect endpoint at which his work would be done. He was constantly in the act of becoming. Such a powerful and concise sentence. He was constantly in the act of becoming. Steve is always changing. At this point, what I would like to do is just take us ahead a little bit in the story. Steve, he's back in the United States. He's again working for Nolan Bushnell at Atari. He's reconnected with his old pal Steve Wozniak, or Woz. They're attending homebrew computer club meetings on quite a regular basis. And Steve, he can see very clearly here that there's this growing desire for better computing. He has a vision and he takes action. Steve knew that Woz was so uniquely talented that any computer he would design would be cheap, usable, and easy to program. So much so that the other hobbyists at Homebrew might want one. So during the fall and winter of 1975 and early 76, as Woz perfected his designs, jobs started to conjure how they might pool their resources to purchase the components that were needed to make a working prototype. Every couple of weeks, they would take the latest working version of the computer to homebrew meetings to show off the new features or two to the roughest audience in town. Steve persuaded Woz that they could make the club members their customers by selling them the schematics and perhaps even printed circuit boards. And right here, they both go all in. To raise the cash to pay a mutual friend to draw a reference design for the circuit board, Steve sold his treasured Volkswagen minibus, and Woz unloaded his precious HP 65 programmable calculator. After spending $1,000 on designing the board and contracting to have a few dozen made, Steve and Woz made their money back and then some by selling them to fellow homebrew members for $50 apiece, netting them a nifty $30 for each circuit board. Steve believes in his vision. Woz trusts his engineering skills. After they make a few sales, they can see the road that's ahead of them. Steve decides to call the new company Apple. They grind hard on their new circuit board. It contains a microprocessor, it has RAM, a CPU, and a power supply. All you needed was a monitor. In those days, that was simply just a TV and a keyboard. Steve pushes and Woz engineers the first true personal computer. This device allows the users to write their own computer programs thanks to that microprocessor that had been built in. Each time the user puts a keystroke into the keyboard, they can immediately see it on the monitor. This is mind-blowing stuff. And I chuckle a little, but it really was mind-blowing stuff. No one was doing this. No one. And they call it Apple One. Now back at Homebrew, the members, they don't really give it much love. I mean, this is a club where people tinker and build their own stuff. It really was the wrong target audience for a board that's mostly ready to go out of the box. But luck, it's really on their side here. At the meeting was a gentleman by the name of Paul Terrell, and he is the owner of the Byte Shop computer store. He tells Stephen Woz that he's interested in the machine and that, they should just stay in touch here and there and maybe they can possibly do some business together. Well, for Steve, that's like shining the spotlight on something. He's all in because this is an extremely hot lead. The very next day, they go out, they borrow a friend's car, and they head over to the Byte Shop. As they walk into the store, they're just two young entrepreneurs looking for a possibility. Terrell surprised them, saying that if the two Steves could deliver 50 fully assembled circuit boards with all the chips soldered into place by a certain date, he would pay them $500 a pop. In other words, 10 times what Steve and Woz had been charging club members for the printed circuit boards alone. Without missing a beat, Steve happily promised delivery even though he and Woz had neither the wherewithal to buy the computers or anything like the factory space or labor force needed to build anything. The world as they know it as they walk out of the Byte Shop would never be the same. And that is amazing. They land a $25,000 deal right there. But as outlined in the book, there are a lot of nevers. They never manufactured at scale. They never formally financed a business. They never sold anything of real value. They never took an order. The biggest lesson here out of this we can learn is Steve doesn't give two shits about the nevers. Those are simply poor excuses. Just get started. Everything else can be learned along the way. They set up a makeshift factory in a spare bedroom at Steve's parents' house. Steve hires sister Patty to solder parts. When Turnell orders the next round of 50, they expand from the bedroom to the garage. And that really makes me smile right there. And we get to see the first great taste of Steve Jobs running his company. Steve was more focused than anyone. He prodded the team ceaselessly. When things went wrong, he moved fast. After an old girlfriend failed to solder a few chips correctly, he made her the team's bookkeeper. His temper was short, and he never hesitated to belittle their work when something went wrong. Now, he had to begin to learn one of his first management lessons, namely that his temper, properly targeted, could actually be a very effective motivational tool. It was a lesson that would prove hard to undo. The temperate drives output. That gives Steve and Apple early success, but it's also going to be a really big downfall, almost destroying him along the way. While the Apple One had only sold somewhere around 200 units, it was the machine that spit out dot after dot. Steve, he's making the connections and he's 100% locked in on the mission. Both he and Woz knew that they could make a better machine. One thing is missing here. They needed capital. Steve began to make a real effort to connect with Silicon Valley's cloistered world of successful entrepreneurs, marketers, and financiers. That word cloistered is sheltered. It was really hard to crack into, but we know Steve, he's not afraid to pick up the telephone. He had no qualms about calling anyone in search of information or help. Heck, he'd been doing that since his phone call to Bill Hewlett when he was 14 years old. I love his drive, and it does pay off for him. Steve finds himself connecting with a gentleman by the name of Regis McKenna, who is described as a marketing whiz who would later be instrumental in building Apple in the public's mind. Check this out. This is how their first meeting with McKenna goes. Steve and Woz met McKenna at his offices. Steve certainly didn't dress up for the meeting. As usual, his jeans had holes, his hair was unbrushed, and he wore no shoes. And he smelled. McKenna, he takes a liking to Steve and he directs him over to Don Valentine, founding partner of Sequoia Capital. Valentine, he takes the meeting simply out of respect for his friend McKenna. And listen to what Valentine says right here. Why did you send me these renegades from the human race? I just imagine Steve walking in. He's barefoot. He's smelling. His hair's all messed up. Hands out, asking for money. Yet, a smooth talking Jobs. He has this pitch about the future of Apple II and the computer that they're making and what it could do. Well, Valentine, he does see through the mess here and he sees the value. He passes them over to another gentleman by the name of Mike Markula. And this changes everything for Stephen Woz. And real briefly, let's just talk about this angel investor, Markula, that is. He is a former Intel sales executive, and he had done so well with the company that he had retired in his early 30s. Along with that, he has an advanced degree in electrical engineering. So at heart, he really is a computer geek. So they arrange for Markula to visit the factory, Steve's parents' garage, that is. In Markula, upon arrival, he can immediately see the potential for the Apple computer and what it might be. Along with this, he can really see the intelligence of Steve and Woz. They go back and forth, Jobs and Markula. Two great salesmen are both driving exactly for what they want out of the deal. In one of the greatest angel investments of all time, Markula ponied up $92,000 out of his own pocket and arranged for another $250,000 line of credit with the Bank of America in return for 1/3 stake in Apple. Plain and simple, that is amazing. Markula, he also insists that Woz quit his job over at HP so that he could focus on Apple full time. Woz agrees. Then the big change here. Markula insists that they convert the company from a limited partnership into a California corporation so that they could bring in a professional CEO. And that person is Michael Scott. And I just laugh a little bit there, picturing Michael Scott from The Office. But of course, it wasn't. Michael Scott, they call him Scotty. Markula, he is going to become the first chairman of the board. Scotty is obviously the CEO. And from the book here, it was February 1977, and Steve, all of 21 years old, had turned Apple over to adult supervision. Unfortunately, neither Markula nor Scotty could ever become the mentor he needed. Steve's parents, they get their garage back, and the company moves into its first offices in Cupertino. Scotty, he takes care of all the basics on the business side that you need. Building out the manufacturing processes once Steve's finished with the designs, building the sales team, building an executive team, handling all of the finances for which Steve knows or cares nothing about. Steve's goal here is to drive the shit out of a small team to build Apple II. Once again, Jobs was the impresario and Woz the engineering genius. Steve pushed Woz, cajoling him, berating him, and challenging his thinking. Woz responded by giving his new machine a versatility and instant usefulness never before seen in the microcomputer. It was the most complete computer in a single, manageable box the world had ever seen. It had an audio amplifier and a speaker, and jacks for plugging in a joystick for gameplay and a cassette tape drive for cheap data storage. He also built the basic programming language right into the system, loading into it a special chip of its own that was hardwired to the motherboard. Pure gold. Consumers love it. They show it off April of 77 and it starts selling 500 units a month. The second success puts Steve Jobs into the stratosphere in his own mind. It really was superfuel that blasted him to the moon. He had seen how his contrarian thinking was essential for the kinds of breakthrough products he wanted to engineer, and he had also seen that his irascible methods could prod a group of people to deliver that vision. In that word, irascible is easily angered. And I don't think he was wrong. Steve, he absolutely is brilliant in guiding small teams. Yet as a young man, he wasn't prepared to run this rapidly growing company. He just didn't know how to deal with that. The friction between Scotty and Markula, it's gonna start fires. Steve, he develops a reputation as an egomaniac who was not willing to learn from anyone. But that is how people see him. This is a view from the outside world looking in. The author goes on to point out the following in the book. This is where we see those really deep roots of the heart and soul of Steve Jobs starting to develop. Steve, he tells the author about some of his heroes. He says, none of these people were in it for the money, and neither is Steve. Let's keep going here from the book. Dave Packard, for example, left all his money to the foundation. He may have died the richest guy in the cemetery, but he wasn't in it for the money. Bob Noyce, co-founder of Intel, is another. I'm old enough to have been able to get to know these guys. I met Andy Grove, CEO of Intel from 87 to 98, when I was 21. I called him up and told him I had heard he was really good at operations and I asked if I could take him out to lunch. I did that with Jerry Sanders, founder of Advanced Micro Devices, and with Charlie Spruck, founder of National Semiconductors, and others. Basically, I got to know these guys who were all company builders. These are all men who Steve looked up to. He reaches out to them directly to learn from them. Steve, he also admires Edwin Land that we mentioned earlier. Steve admired many things about Land, among him his obsessive commitment to creating products of style, practicality, and great consumer appeal, like the groundbreaking SX70, the folding camera that wowed America in the 1970s. His reliance on gut instinct rather than consumer research, and the relentless obsession and invention he brought to the company he founded. Like the deep obsession Steve has with building his products, he has that same deep obsession to surround himself with the absolute best mentors. That takes us back to Regis McKenna, who had joined Apple at this time as an advisor. A few key points here that feed into the Jobs story. First is that McKenna and Jobs, they're what I call intellectually matched. They're on the same intelligence wavelength. They just got each other. But McKenna, he can see that Steve Jobs has something extra special. Like a busted piece of glass, he has a lot of sharp edges, but there is something in there special. McKenna brings him into his home. The two spent many hours in the basement of McKenna's ranch-style Sunnyvale home, talking about Steve's goals for Apple and its wondrous Apple II. Their conversations ranged widely over design, marketing, product development, and strategy, and how these were intertwined in a healthy business. McKenna was expert at framing a company's development in a narrative Steve could relate to. Right here, this is big. When we mentor others, we need to meet them at a place where they're most comfortable. Here we have a clean dressed, well educated, successful McKenna meeting a young Jobs. And McKenna looks past that surface level stuff and he sees Steve's intelligence and he pours his knowledge into Steve. At the same time, he respects Steve's views. And McKenna, you know what? He was also smart enough to learn from Steve. He wasn't in a position where he thought he knew it all. He was open to learning as well. Together, they work on Apple's first marketing campaign. And I mention this because it matters. The headline for the machine reads, "Simplicity is the ultimate sophistication." And it's so perfect. Simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. It puts Apple into a league of their own, and sales ramp quickly. 7.8 million in 78, up to 47 million in 79, and then almost 118 million in the year 1980. No other company at this time ever grew that fast, and Apple sets its IPO for 1980. Steve is worth $256 million. As revenues grow, so does Steve's ego. The ego is like a torch in kerosene, leading to fire after fire with the executive team. Steve, at this time, he's leading product development at Apple, riding highs like Superman with the Apple I and the Apple II, and he launches into Apple III, insisting that the footprint had to be small and silent, which means no fans. Like a baby that was crawling the full length of the football field, it took forever. Engineers, they have to build a special case of aluminum to draw the heat away from the motherboard, and costs skyrocket. Plus, it has to be backward compatible with the Apple II. Now the baby has to crawl all the way back to the other side of the field. Steve is tired of yelling at the baby. He's a visionary. One day, everything changes when he takes a trip to Xerox to see their Palo Alto Research Center or park, and here is what he saw. The screen could also display and organize the contents of the machine's digital data storage by means of graphical icons, little symbolic figures a tad smaller than a postage stamp, representing documents that could be placed inside folder icons by means of a strange pointing device the geeks at Park called a mouse. This mouse could also be used to directly move a cursor around the document on the screen while writing or editing. Compared to the black and white screen with eerie green characters that had preceded it, this graphical user interface, or GUI as it came to be known, represented at least as radical a break as when silent movies shifted into talkies. Steve realized that the Xerox GUI could be the foundation of something very ambitious and very personal. Visual iconography on a screen could make computing almost intuitive for just about everyone. And staying here just for a minute longer, this interaction, this feeling of comfort with the back and forth with the computer could lead to the realization of Steve's overarching goal, the creation of a truly personal computer for ordinary people. Steve even had a metaphor for what the computer could be, a bicycle for the mind. After visiting Park, he was a changed man. These were technologies he wanted to bring to everyone in the world. Those last four words, everyone in the world. That is the new goal. Steve quits working on Apple III. In his mind, it's simply a fix and flip of the Apple II, and that is shit. No more watching the baby crawl. He wants to work on the machine everyone in the world needs. His new passion is the Lisa. And here's where Steve's personal life and work life get a little bit odd. You see, in 1978, his former girlfriend gives birth to a baby girl that they named Lisa. At birth, Steve goes to visit them for a few days, but then after that time, for whatever reason, he denies being the father. He refuses to pay any child support, and only after a court-ordered paternity test does he start paying child support. For years and years, he has no interaction with Lisa. Even when they're living in a small house just a couple of miles away, no interaction. Now, later in life, he does say that he deeply regrets his actions that he took around that time, and he wishes that he could take them back. But at this time in his life, with this big-ass ego, he turns to the Lisa. And for the next 9 months, he puts everyone in the company through pure hell. He was fascinated by the round edges and the icons on the Lisa interface. The project stalls and costs are excessive. Finally, Scotty, who was the CEO, he kicks Steve off the project. And this, as you can imagine, is a super big hit to his ego. Twice now, in rapid succession, Steve had failed when trying to lead a team to create a computer for the business market. While more and more people in the computer industry were keenly in tune with the needs of the enterprise customers, Steve wasn't one of them. Man, that's just brutal dose of reality from the author. But Steve, he still has a lot of power inside of Apple as one of the founders. Early in 1981, Scotty, he decides to leave the company. Markula, he takes over as the temporary president, but he's not interested in the position. Steve, he wants to bring in the biggest and brightest CEO that he could find. And that's where John Scully enters the picture. At the time, he's president of PepsiCo. He's well educated. I mean, he came up with the Pepsi Challenge, perhaps one of the most brilliant soda campaigns of all time. He is the one who had created that. John and Steve, right off the bat, they see eye to eye, at least for now anyways. And Steve, he seals the deal. He sealed the deal by challenging Scully with a line that would become a famous part of the Steve Jobs lore. Do you want to spend the rest of your life selling sugared water, or do you want to change the world? Back in product development land, Jobs, he really needs another win here. So he decides to take over a small team that was working on a project called Macintosh. That graphical user interface, it's really deep in his mind, and he knows that he can make it work. The first step here is to remove the product manager, and he cuts fast. Steve never really cared if people thought he was selfish or that his elbows were a little too sharp. He was willing to do whatever he felt it took to achieve his goals. As I'm learning more and more about Steve, he reminds me a lot of Jay Gould that we had mentioned earlier. Gould, he also didn't give two shits what others thought about him. In fact, he was constantly dragged through the mud in the media, and he could have cared less. His intense love of building his business was all that he cared about. Steve has a lot of Jay Gould in him. He starts working on the Mac. And right here, we get to see where Apple as a company starts developing a reputation of deep secrecy, only allowing those that needed to know in on the project. Everyone else outside didn't get to learn jack shit. Steve also did everything he could to separate Mac from Apple. He spent $1 million setting up a new home for the team in a separate building at Brandley 3, down the road from Apple headquarters. And I give Steve a lot of credit here. His real brilliance is leading small teams, highly intelligent teams. He pulls together the best engineers that he can find all across the company, and he puts them into their own space. Creativity is multiplied. The Mac project was an expanded version of rallying the gang in the garage, with Steve leading and inspiring a small group of extremely creative people. He stole the best programmers from the Lisa team and other projects around Apple, with a disregard for corporate niceties that was matched only by his boldness. For 2 years, they work on something beautiful. Steve drove them as relentlessly as he drove himself. He reminded them that the fate of the company hinged on their work. He harangued them for failing to meet deadlines and for falling short of perfection. The pressure grew steadily over time. He goes on to inspire them. The work 50 people are doing here, he told them, is going to send a giant ripple through the universe. The journey is the reward. And then at the end, he rewards his team in the following way here. When the job was over, Steve had the signatures of the 46 key players on the team engraved on the inside of every Mac. And something important happens here. Out of that team of 46, he identifies about 4 or 5 that he builds a lot of trust with. This is really new for Steve Jobs, at least with these select few individuals, and soon they're going to follow him to a new company. But before we get there, the Mac. As he had seen at Xerox's Park, you could use the mouse to move things around this beautiful GUI interface. Sales, they start well, but they quickly slump. Truth is, the Mac that Steve delivered was deeply flawed. It was a brilliant piece of engineering with a gorgeous vision of where computing could go, but it was far too underpowered to be useful. Apple II, it continues to carry the company. For Steve, this is 3 failures in a row. Mac development costs are in the millions with little to show for the company. Scully, the CEO, he plays executioner. He asks Steve to step down from the Mac. Steve, he tries to respond to Scully with a fuck you by having him fired from the board while he was going to be away on a trip to China, but that backfires. Scully, he gets tipped off and he cancels his trip to China. The next day, Scully, I really do admire what he does here. He goes to the executive board and he says, you either support Steve or you support me. Make a choice. And if you ask me, that's leadership right there. If you're not going to support me, I'm out. Let Steve run it. If you're going to support me, get rid of Steve. Make the choice. From the book here. One by one, around the conference table, everyone explained why they would support Scully. Steve watched as support he had counted on, which he had always expected would be there at the end, vanished. And I tell you, that's brutal. It's just brutal. Put yourself in Steve's shoes. The company that you founded, all these people, they have high paying jobs because of you. They all turn your back on you. From the book again here. Steve knew he was finished at Apple. Steve's exile was complete and designed to humiliate. He was given an office in another building far from Scully. For the next 3 or 4 months, it's really just low level work for Steve, and he freaking hates it, with one exception here. He visited the graphics group made up of leading edge computer graphics technicians who were working for film director George Lucas of Star Wars fame, and began to think that the possibilities for computing with high end 3D graphic images were limitless. In my notes here, I wrote Steve is excellent at seeing the usefulness of future tech before anyone. And what happens next, it's really a blessing for Steve. It doesn't look like it at the time because he goes to the Apple board and he suggests that they buy this group from Lucasfilms. And what do? They blow him off. It's really a gut punch at the time. But for Steve, this is one of the biggest parts of becoming Steve Jobs. He's going to learn endless lessons here in the very near future. And the folks that he meets at Lucasfilms, they have a big impact on his comeback. But for now, Steve, he decides to leave the company. His plan is to take what he calls some low-level Apple employees and develop a computer for the upper end of higher education for research and the like. And it's guaranteed not to compete with Apple. The Apple board agrees. Steve, of course, has his fingers crossed behind his back, so he resigns. His next big thing is Next, a computer company. He starts it with $12 million of his own money. And let me tell you, it's one bad decision after another. Steve really went through hell. While he projects this rock hard exterior to most of the outside world, inside, he's learning. It just takes a lot of time. All of the details are in the book, and I really do hope that you can pick up a copy of the book for all of these fine details. I want to spend some time in this section calling out a few of those difficult lessons that he learned and look at a few of the key turning points for Steve that puts him on the path to becoming Steve Jobs. Right from the start, the author says the following. He was immature and adolescent in so many ways, egocentric, unrealistically idealistic, and unable to manage the ups and downs of real relationships. Steve was too self-centered to see how much Apple's success had depended on a combination of perfect timing and the work of others. Nor did he recognize how much he had contributed to its many problems. Thankfully for Steve, he has a really big checkbook and 5 other loyal Apple employees that helped him get Next off of the ground. Now, what happens next in the story is quite fascinating. Steve and his new company, they're going to be featured on a PBS show called The Entrepreneurs. While cameras are rolling, Steve, he's really charismatic and confident. And I watched that episode on YouTube. It's quite impressive, I must say. Steve appears to have everything buttoned up. And it was enough for Ross Perot, after watching the program, to back Next with $20 million of his own money. Perot, he sees Steve as this young prodigy, and he's really hands off. He thinks that Steve can do everything. Perot is later going to say that that was a big fat mistake on his part. But this investment, it just elevates Next in the eyes of the outside world. So much so that Canon, they're going to kick in $100 million a short time later. Steve claimed from the start that he wanted Next to feel like a startup in a garage, but it was anything but that. One of his first acts was to go out and hire Paul Rand, who was this famous logo designer. I think he did the IBM logo. Well, anyways, he pays Rand $100,000 for a logo. I mean, that's not a startup in a garage. That's just the tip of the iceberg from the book here. Extravagant expenditure soon came standard operating procedure at Next, especially when it came to the company's headquarters. The Palo Alto offices featured expensive, custom designed furnishings, Ansel Adams prints, and a kitchen with a gigantic countertop. And when Next moved into bigger offices in Redwood City in 1989, no expense was spared. That's just the office. If we turn the view to the factory, we can learn the following. The centerpiece of Steve's spending was the state of the art manufacturing facility to churn out Next computers, a factory designed to be the envy of the world. He took great pride in every detail, pointing out the robots and machines that had been repainted in tones of gray that he had specified. More important, he felt that the seeming perfection of the place and its obsessive focus on its details sent a message to the employees. You'll achieve greater results than you could ever imagine. And he has one thing right here, leading by example. When you set the pace for your team and establish the baseline of what you expect in terms of quality, the team is going to follow. But for Jobs, he has very lofty visions for the factory. He claims that it can produce 600 machines a day. In reality, per the author, it never produces more than 600 machines a month. Ouch, that is a big hit. Steve, he is obsessed about the next computer. Creating a perfect cube with true sharp angles required expensive custom molds, which could only come from specialty metal shops in Chicago. Jobs also insisted that the case be made from magnesium, which is far more expensive than plastic. Magnesium had certain advantages over plastic, but it was much harder to machine perfectly, leading to more flaws in the manufacturing process. Then inside of the machine, Steve forces his engineers to design this perfectly square motherboard. They push back saying, why does this even matter? We just need to put something in the machine that's going to work. No one cares. No one looks inside. Steve cares. No detail was too small to overlook. His focus is intense. It goes all the way back to 5-year-old Steve Jobs at his workbench, learning that there was as much beauty on the underside as the top side. Everything matters, including the operating system. And this is one thing that Steve does get right, but the payoff is going to be many, many years in the future for the OS. The next step operating system that Tribble and Tevian developed truly was elegant. In typical Jobs fashion, it put a gorgeous, approachable face on an operating system that previously only engineers had been able to decipher. In one of those programs that they write for Next, it's called Web Objects. It allows programmers to quickly build websites, and this is going to be important in the near future. So at this point in the story, we're about 3 years or so into Next. And there's this building sense of urgency for the public to see what they're working on. All this money had been dumped into Next, but not a lot is coming out. So in a grand Steve Jobs style, what does he do? He plans to debut Next to the computer world. And I want to spend a few minutes talking about how Steve prepares, because this hits hard for you and I. Also, in my own view, he was preparing to show the world something that was far from finished. So it took a lot of smoke and mirrors because there's obviously no product to show. For 2.5 hours, Steve, before this audience of 3,000 people, he lays out a new vision for the computer industry and why that vision was the heart of the next computer. For weeks, Steve and his team, they work on slides, every detail, even the minutest of colors here, because no computer application yet existed to automate the process. Work on the slides had gone on and on. After days of trying to find the exact shade of green for one slide, Steve finally found a tone he liked and kept muttering, "Great green, great green." Then with each slide, he practices it over and over and over. Each word, how to say it, when to speak, when to pause. Every detail is perfect. As the demo went on, Steve's claims became more grandiose, as if these next machines might revolutionize the academics of not just science, but the arts as well. Steve, he's building his audience like only a master orator can. I wish that I had 1/20th of his skills. Nevertheless, to say the reaction is over the top. Industry experts, they project that next sales are easily going to be $200-300 million a year by 1990. That's less than 2 years from now. From my view here, Steve spends months developing this 2.5 hour presentation that's over the top and did exactly what he wanted it to. His ego, this feeling of power after 2.5 hours, it's the most powerful drug in the world for Steve. And remember, this is 2.5 hours, because soon in the story, this powerful, powerful drug of people seeing Steve as a god or as a superhero, it's going to be delivered in just 90 seconds. And this is going to be a game changer. And we'll get there, I promise. In the meantime, it's more bad decisions by Jobs. You see, IBM, they wanted to license the next OS or next step. They're not 100% comfortable relying upon Microsoft for all of their OS needs and functionality. So they wanted a second option. As part of an agreement, they're going to supply Next with $60 million. But Steve simply nukes the deal, to say it politely. From the book here. Dan Lewin, who would meet with Steve to carefully plot their strategy before every IBM meeting, never knew what to expect from his boss. Sometimes Steve would completely undermine the groundwork the two of them had carefully laid. I'd sit there and literally kick him under the table, Lewin recalls. There was one meeting, for example, where he went in and actually told them, I really don't understand why you guys would want to help us. Talk about boldness. Couple of points here that I can see. At the time, Next, they have about $120 million of cash on hand. So I think Steve felt really comfortable from that perspective. But more importantly, we learn here, Steve had always envisioned Next Step as the backbone of his own spectacular computer. He wanted to be the hero, not a secondary partner to a more powerful company. If IBM had exploited his operating system and sold a lot of computers running their version of Next Step, the glory would have been theirs, not his. The IBM relationship fails. Worse yet is that Lewin, his brilliant head of sales, approaches Steve and quits. And he tells Steve on the way out that if he wants to succeed, he needs to listen to people. Otherwise, he's going to be doomed. Lewin's words don't completely fall on deaf ears. It may appear so at the time. It just takes Steve this really long time to start showing that he's learning. The chain reaction of executives leaving the company continues, and by the end of 1991, those 5 brave souls that followed Steve from Apple are all gone. As Steve's derailing the train at Next, we need to turn our focus over to Lucasfilms and the graphics division called Pixar. The initial spark for Jobs is this long-term vision, because at Next, he sees his target market as hospitals, corporations, and universities. And he believes that the software tools that the film studios are using for these 3D objects could be imported into his computer systems. And they're first class in that they could really help his commercial customers. That's the goal at the start. Now, to get into the deal, George Lucas, he was really strapped for cash. He needed it to clear up a divorce settlement. So he had decided to sell this division of his company, or Pixar, we'll call it. Or Pixar it was, I guess. Steve, he drove a really hard bargain and he pays $5 million in cash. This is far below Lucas's asking price, but he's desperate. Steve, he also agrees to capitalize the company with $5 million. 100% of this is all of his money right here. Now at Pixar, Steve, he operates very differently, and I believe that he learns the most from Pixar, and he uses this as a safe space for learning. This is all brand new, so he doesn't have an ego inside of Pixar. It's nothing but pure learning. There's nothing to lose. And what he does learn here, he transports it back into the computer business. In the author, he really drives this home for us. At Pixar, he would lay the foundation of two of his great strengths: his ability to fight back in times of distress and his ability to make the most of an innovation that put him ahead of anyone else in that field. In other words, it taught him how to keep his head and how to fight back when cornered and how to run like the wind in the open field. And it became the place where he really learned, albeit slowly and reluctantly and against his natural instincts, that sometimes the best management technique is to forego micromanagement and give good, talented people the room they need to succeed. When the book is called Becoming Steve Jobs, this is the becoming line, and it's really easy to miss. Let me read it here. Without the lessons he learned at Pixar, there would have been no great second act at Apple. Plain and simple, Steve needed Pixar, and the man running Pixar, Ed Catmull. And let me tell you right here, I'm impressed by Catmull in this book. And I actually just ordered his book, Creativity Inc., and I'm looking forward to reading and sharing that book with you in the near future. When Steve came into Pixar, he could see that they already had a strong culture. There was nothing he could do to create a new one. It's not a startup. He's not the founder. All he did was write a check. Catmull, he knew Jobs' reputation, but he is used to dealing with egocentric assholes in the film business. He doesn't back down. Instead, he goes the other way. He takes Steve head on and he embraces Steve and the intention that he needs. Catmull walks him through every step of how a movie is made, including his own management and reasoning style at each step in the process. He's educating Steve here. He's leading with a true, genuine heart. Catmull slowly shows Steve that it's okay to let the creative people do their work. In addition, he teaches Steve how to give negative feedback in private and then to praise people in public. And probably one of the most important things here, how to stay calm under pressure. Jobs and Catmull, they end up working together for more than 26 years. Catmull was one of those handful of deep friendships that Steve nourished because he loved Apple and he loved Catmull. And if we step back and we look at the bigger picture here, something quite amazing is going to happen at Pixar. If you recall earlier in the episode, not that long ago here, we spoke about how Steve prepared for months and months on end for that 2.5-hour presentation that he gave to show the world the next computer that wasn't even ready to go yet. Well, over at Pixar, they're about to have a little presentation of their own. That year at SIGGRAPH, which is the special interest group on computer graphics and interactive techniques, I had to look that up myself to see what that meant. Pixar, they're about to unveil a 90-second spot to a crowd of about 6,000. And what I'm about to read here are the words from John Lasseter, who was the director of this short animation and another one of Steve's longtime trusted friends and business partners. All of a sudden, our little Luxo Jr. comes up. You know, the little hopping lamp? It's only a minute and a half long, but even before the thing is over, people are cheering. That moment is remembered as significant in the computer graphics history because it was the first time a 3D computer animated film entertained audiences with its story and characters, not the mere fact of being made with a computer. It got a standing ovation before it was done. The crowd knew they had seen something brand new. And Steve turned to me with these big eyes, Lassiter continues, his own eyes bulging like, this is great. Wow, I love this. Getting that immediate response from an audience was something he had never experienced. The bug had bitten him, and he was like, I love this. 90 seconds changes everything for Steve. Lassiter comes to Steve a few weeks later asking for a budget for their next short called Tin Story. His response, just make it great. They make it so great that it wins an Oscar in 1989. That same year, Stevie also meets his wife, Lorraine. She was sitting in a front row of a lecture that he was giving at Stanford Business School. And he can't stop looking at her the entire time he's up on stage. And as a man who knows what he wants, he tracks her down in the parking lot afterwards and he asks her to dinner. They went out that very night. With the exception of Steve's rare business trips, they were together pretty much every day for the rest of their lives. And I think we can understand why right here from the book. She was intelligent and well-spoken and very athletic, and a vivid reader with electric interest in literature and the arts, nutrition, politics, and philosophy, and unlike Steve, she followed professional sports. After 2 years of dating, they're going to be married in 1991 and would remain so until they parted at the time of Steve's death. Now, if we go back to Pixar here, Steve, he has some really hard choices to make. He decides to put all of his chips on software and animation, and he unloads the hardware division. Staff is reduced from 120 down to a slim 42 people. Steve, he's writing check after personal check to keep Pixar alive at this time. He's really all in, and he invests more than $50 million into the company. He really doesn't want another dumpster fire on his hands, and it was a lot easier for him to keep dumping money into the company than to fail. And it's really Hail Mary time. And who do they need? Disney. This is who they need. Lasseter, Catmull, and everyone else at Pixar, on the other hand, fully realized that making a movie for Disney was probably their only chance to survive as a company. The negotiations were their last stand, and their fate was in the hands of Steve. So Steve meets with Jeffrey Katzenberg, who was the head of Disney's animation studio. And both of these guys, they have Grand Canyon-sized egos. But Steve, he knows that he really needs Disney to survive. So they end up working out a deal to make the movie called Toy Story. Disney, it funds productions and retains ownership of all of the film material and all of the characters that get developed. Pixar, they're going to get 12.5% of the box office sales. Plus, they get 2 more movies after this one. And there's a key lesson here for you and I. And it doesn't involve jobs. At Pixar, 4 key employees, including Lasseter, they develop what is called a brain trust. So you have writers, directors, and animators that are part of this trust. And their job is to provide constructive criticism to directors of every Pixar movie. Now, it doesn't have any authority to make the directors do what they say. It's simply to provide honest and open feedback. But Steve, he's on the sidelines and he's watching all of this. He's learning a lot. Watching our collaboration, seeing us make ourselves better by working together, I think that fueled Steve, says Lasseter. I think that was one of the key changes when he went back to Apple. He was more open to the talent of others. to be inspired by and challenged by that talent, but also to the idea of inspiring them to do amazing things he knew he couldn't do himself. In my book here, I wrote Steve Jobs finds the trust dot, and he connects the trust dot to his map. This teaches us a great lesson that we have to trust our team, lead them, but let them do what they do best. For Steve, it was letting the creative storytellers develop Toy Story. On the other hand here, Jobs, he has a grand vision for the company. IPO. And what fuels this? A Disney princess. And I can hear you asking, what? And I felt the same way, but it's true. You see, Disney, they premiere Pocahontas in New York Central Park for free for up to 100,000 people. And then on top of that, they're going to dump more than $100 million into marketing of the movie. We lock it down here from the book. Steve's eyes grew really big. He appreciated a masterful product launch, and his own introductions paled against this one. That's when he got serious about cooking up an audacious plan for the initial public offering of Pixar stock. His goal was to raise enough money for the company to fund its own movie productions. Steve sets the IPO date for 1 week after the launch of Toy Story. Big steel balls, if you ask me. Fortunately, Toy Story is a masterpiece. The American Film Institute places it in the top 100 films ever made, even today. On IPO, they raise $132 million. The company is now valued at $1.4 billion. Steve owns 80% of the company. 80%, that's just crazy. He calls his friend Larry Ellison and he says, I made it. Indeed, he had made it. Steve is now in the billionaire club. Yet, that is nothing. What matters most is identity, because he sees Next as a cold computer company that just sold computers to institutions, or tried to sell them anyways. Pixar, they made warm, family-friendly movies. Products that really impact people's lives, products that people could feel happy about and tell stories about, tell their friends and family about. Steve knows that he needs to do this exact same thing with computers. The big question is how to combine this art and technology. Pixar injects new confidence in Steve. This success, this is becoming Steve Jobs, and we're seeing it happening in slow motion right here in the book, and this is why I love books. 50 pages before this, I had this feeling of wanting to stop reading. Like I said, I was embarrassed by the chain of failures and the chain of mistakes that Steve is making time and time again. Now, I'm excited for Steve. I keep turning the pages faster and faster. If we flip back to the next, things are not going that well over there. Steve does the same thing as he did at Pixar in the early days. He shuts down the hardware division, closes the factory, fires half of the staff. The original dream that Next would create the world's next great computer was over. There was no hiding Next's failure. There was no hiding the fact that Next's failure was primarily Steve's doing. This was the low point of Steve's career. For Steve and Next, the saving grace is the internet. By 1996, their web objects licensing, it was generating more revenues than their Next Step operating system, and they're starting to show a tiny profit for the very first time. Over at Apple, his old company, things are quite tough. That Apple logo, it's looking more and more like an eaten up Apple core. They're close to default on a lot of their banknotes. They're losing money hand over fist. Microsoft dominates 95% of the computer market. Pile on the new Windows 95 operating system. with a long list of features like running multiple programs at once and autosave that Mac couldn't come anywhere close to matching. For 8 years, Apple pounds away at trying to make a new OS. Failure after failure. Each year, sales are going down. Apple CEO Gil Amelio, or the so called turnaround expert, he really needed to go shopping for a new operating system. He knows they couldn't afford to continue with the bullshit that they were trying to make. It's desperate times. And what results is Apple buying Next for $429 million. And it only takes 10 days to negotiate. Steve's selling strength right here, and I admire what he did right here, is his world-class team of engineers at Next. He uses that strong team as a position to say, look, if you want us, you gotta pay for us. And Gil could see that they really had the perfect OS that Apple desperately needs. The cherry on top is that web objects tool that had become quite popular. With the deal done, Jobs, he agrees to rejoin Apple as a special advisor to the CEO. Steve's view of Emilio? Well, I'll just tell you how the author describes it. This is probably best. On a Saturday in late December, Steve invited me over to his house. He was already working on his remarks for Macworld, and he wanted me to see how the lines would resonate. But he also wanted to talk about Emilio. You wouldn't believe what a bozo Emilio is, he hissed. What most galled him was that Emilio, he felt, had no clue about selling to walking, breathing people. All he knows is the chip business, where you can count your customers on one hand, Steve groused. They aren't people, they're companies, and they buy chips by the tens of thousands. In my book here, I wrote that Steve enjoys selling products to people that make an impact on their lives. This is what he learned from Pixar. Jobs, he goes on to say the following. I can tell that there are still a lot of really good people at Apple. I just don't think that Emilio is the right guy to lead them. And the author asks Steve a really big question. Well, what about you, Steve? Like I said, big question. And in my mind, when I was reading this, I kind of just really expected that Steve's face would light up right away with this super big smile, like, yeah, that's going to be me. But his reaction here, Steve hemmed and hawed. He seemed as unsure of himself as I had ever seen him. And we're noticing a new Steve. He's a more thoughtful man who's walking the path a bit more slowly and with intention. However, it doesn't take Steve long to see why Apple is going over the cliff. The more he got to know Emilio, the more he realized that Dr. Gill and his team could never lead Apple back to any kind of prominence. Now, Emilio, he had been brought in as this turnaround expert. Steve's observation here about this. But how can he be a turnaround expert, Steve asked me, when he eats his lunch alone in his office with food served to him on china that looks like it came from Versailles? And then add to the fact that Emilio's executive suite was just loaded with yes men that he knew from the semiconductor industry. And then in public, he was simply a disaster. As an example, Steve loved to retell this story. Let me read it for you. This is classic. Once, while talking to a group at a dinner party that included Larry Ellison, Emilio tried to put his company's problems in perspective for the other guests. Apple is a boat, he said. There's a hole in the boat, and it's ticking on water. But there's also treasure on board. And the problem is, everyone on board is rowing in different directions. So the boat is just standing still. My job is to get everyone rowing in the same direction. After Emilio walked away, Ellison turned to the person standing next to him and asked, but what about the hole? That was one story Steve never got tired of telling. A few weeks later here, Steve doubles down on his statement to the author. I know I've said it before, but Emilio is a total bozo, he said. He is the absolute wrong person to be leading Apple. I don't know who the right person is, but it's definitely not him. 6 months after the sale of Next to Apple, Steve dumps all of his Apple shares except one. No warning, he just dumps them on the market. The sale was a high decibel vote of no confidence. Emilio felt stabbed in the back, and he had been. Emilio's time is short. Ed Woolard called Emilio at his vacation home in Lake Tahoe to tell him he was fired. Then the chairman called Steve to see if he would be willing to come back as CEO. Again, Steve, he's still hesitant. The temporary CEO position, it goes to Anderson, who at the time was their CFO. And I just want to pause here and say that Anderson was brought in as a financial expert at a very difficult time in Apple's tenure as a company. They were almost bankrupt. And Anderson was able to restructure them financially and turn them around. I think that Anderson's involvement in Apple kept them afloat long enough for Gil to buy Next and then bring Steve in. And without Anderson, Apple possibly would have died. And that is a whole story in itself. But I just wanted to pause briefly and call that out. Anderson was a key player at Apple for a very long time. Now, Anderson, he doesn't want the job either. And Steve, he agrees to help him find a new CEO. But it really doesn't take long for Jobs to start making bold turnaround moves right here for the company. And his first big act is that he insists that employee stock options be repriced to $13.81, which was the price at the time of Emilio's firings. After Emilio had been fired, those options had dropped to rock bottom levels. And he really wants to show employees that he cares about them and what they have invested into the company. And in a memo that gets sent out to all employees telling them about this repricing, whose signature is at the very bottom? Steve Jobs. That's 8,000 employees. And Steve, he's really gesturing to them saying that we value you, we need you, and we trust you. Steve's next step here is to convince the board chairman, Ed Woolard, to replace most of the board. He needs a board that has a backbone to make bold choices. And they bring in the following: Oracle founder Larry Ellison, former IBM and Chrysler CFO Jerry York, Intuit CEO Bill Campbell, and Steve himself. The third thing Steve does here is he needs to work out a deal with Microsoft. Bill Gates doesn't want to develop a new Office suite for the Mac. Mac sales, they had been tanking for a long time, and he doesn't see any value in the time that it's going to take to develop that new Office suite. But Steve, he has a really big card to play here. Apple has this long-standing patent suit against Microsoft, alleging that Windows had replicated a lot of the conventions of the Mac GUI. Gates, he really wants to get this damn suit settled. Emilio had been working with Gates, but at a snail's pace. Not Steve. When Steve called Gates, he kept things simple. He explained that he would be willing to drop the patent litigation, but for a price. Not only did he want Microsoft to publicly announce a 5-year commitment to provide Office for the Mac, he also wanted his powerful rival to publicly and financially make clear that this was an endorsement of Apple's new direction by purchasing $150 million in non-voting shares. In other words, Steve wasn't asking for a loan, he was asking Bill to put his money where his mouth was. Super simple. I love that. Bill Gates' reaction to all of this right here. I had been negotiating this deal with Emilio, and Gil wanted 6 things, most of which were not important. Gil was complicated. I'd be calling him on the phone, faxing him stuff over the holidays. And then when Steve comes in, he looks at the deal and says, here are the 2 things I want, and here's what you want from us. And we had a deal done very quickly. At this point, I believe Steve's mind is made up. He loves Apple, and he's going to lead Apple. as the interim CEO, or as he liked to say, I CEO. And that's funny. But this time, a different Steve Jobs leads the company. He learned to value patience and absorb from Ed Catmull some proven managerial principles for leading a company loaded with creative talent. He had seen the long, slow, and twisting build of a great product as John Lasseter and his crew followed their instincts for good and for bad, bit by bit, until their little idea of making a movie about playthings turned into the masterpiece of Toy Story. He had taken all of this to heart in a way no one could have predicted and he could not have explained. It's time to think different. They put these words into action with the Think Different campaign. Steve works directly on every sentence, every word, right up to the day of very launch, and it reads as follows. Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in square holes, the ones who see things different. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things, they invent, they imagine, they heal, they explore, they create, they inspire, they push the human race forward. Maybe they have to be crazy. How else can you stare at an empty canvas and see a work of art, or sit in silence and hear a song that's never been written, or gaze at a red planet and see a laboratory on wheels? We make tools for these kinds of people. While some see them as the crazy ones, we see genius, because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. Man, I love that. Steve, he spends $100 million on this campaign. It allows everyone to feel as if they're part of the celebration. Apple is simply there to guide them on their individual journeys. Be crazy, be the genius one, and think different. Simply brilliant. Steve's next big step here at the company, he cuts off licensing of the Mac OS. And we saw earlier in the episode how he had nuked that IBM deal because he didn't want them licensing Next Step. It's the same thing here. He wants complete control of his OS. This is his company. They're making it and they're going to use it on their own freaking computers, not someone else. He wants to make the best. And speaking of the best, he looks at employees saying the following. When I returned to Apple, I was blown away by the fact that a third of the people there were really A to A plus people, the kind you'd do anything to hire. Another third were very good. You know, the really solid kind of people every company needs. And then there was another third who were unfortunate. I don't know whether they'd ever been good or not, but it was time for them to leave. This is something that Jobs did extremely well while he was away from Apple. He only wants to surround himself with A players. Next, in Pixar, they were full of A and A plus players. Steve lets go of almost 4,000 people at Apple. And for you and I, it's just an excellent reminder that we should be working to hire the best talent that we can find in our industries. Next up here, Steve looks at the product lineup and it is a disaster. The key was to simplify Apple's ambitions so that the company could sharply focus its substantial engineering talent and brand equity on a few key products and broad markets. He wanted everyone working from the same playbook, and he wanted that game plan to be crystal clear. So simple, but so hard to do, a crystal clear plan, so that everyone knows exactly where to focus. For the product set, it's also simple. Steve set out to show how Apple could transform itself into a profitable company while offering no more than 4 basic products, 2 separate models of desktop PCs, one for consumers and one for professionals, and 2 separate laptop versions aimed at those same constituencies. That is, 4 quadrants, 4 product lines. And when I read that, I can't help but think about Harry Schneider, the founder of In-N-Out. Harry was the same way. He kept things very simple. Hamburgers, cheeseburgers, fries, drinks. That's it. Simple. Focus on simple and make it the best you possibly can. Steve, he's always moving forward, and he would often say the following: "The past can be a lesson, but the past is gone." His question was always, what are we going to do to move forward? And it was always about moving forward with a clear plan and clear communication. But what the company needs right now, more than anything, is a new hot product. Steve's made a lot of changes. He has a strong board. He has a strong executive team. He has a strong employee base. He's backed it with strong marketing. Enter the picture, Johnny Ive. Ive had moved with his wife from London to work at Apple as a product designer many years before. And like Jobs, Ive loves Apple. Right away, they match up intellectually, and their views on design of products as beautiful art, they match perfectly. So they start working on the iMac together. The I at the time is for internet, because it includes this built-in Ethernet connection. And this was a hot new feature in 1998 so that you could connect your computer to, well, the internet, obviously. And I remember when the iMac came out, it was the coolest new computer on the market. I had just graduated high school, and that was like my dream to have an iMac, but it was so expensive. There's no way I could have ever afforded it at that time. For many consumers, that I means something else. It means me, because this is my computer, and it's going to allow me to think different. It's a beautiful blend of marketing and products and human emotion. If we jump into the book right here, the iMac's radical design sent exactly the kind of reassuring, friendly, and differentiating message that Steve wanted to send. With one product, Apple had reinforced its position as the personal computer company. The iMac was a vivid reminder that personal computers are tools for people, and that they should both reflect and amplify an individual's own personality. That's why the iMac was an instant success, selling nearly 2 million units in the first 12 months of production and becoming Apple's first bona fide hit in years. Then for the business market, they developed the Power Mac. This allows engineers, architects, publishers, ad agencies, and web designers to all think different. Steve drills into all of the details up close and personal. We went over OS X again and again, remembers Slade. Pixel by pixel, feature by feature, screen by screen. Should the genie look like this? How big should the dock icons magnify? What's the type style? Why does this dial look the way it does? Every week, the agenda was to get Steve to approve the look and feel of each item. There is nothing in the operating system that he didn't approve. And then the results here. Macs crash far less than Wintel PCs. A single haywire program wouldn't take down the whole system. The machines seem almost immune to software viruses, and its basic file system was easy to navigate and gave us the choice of 3 different ways to view and locate files in a list format. This is the foundation of the future right here. 3 years after his return to Apple, who at that time was on the brink of death, they're now back into profitability. The holes in Emilio's boat have been patched up, and the team is rowing together into the future. Now, they're no longer stuck in the past, but to the outside world, they still see sales numbers that are less than when Steve arrived. Even though they're profitable, they're selling less. But Steve does what Steve does best, and he keeps driving his small, powerful, impactful teams forward. And a small chain of learning events is going to lead them to the next big breakthrough. You see, as part of the iMac, they had included the software program that was called iMovie, and it allowed users to create and edit their own home movies on their computers. But it's not anywhere close to being a hit. So Steve, he asked his executive team one weekend to make a little movie. It's a little contest, if you will, between all of them. And what they found was quite insightful. The movies, they're fun to watch, but the process to create a 4-minute movie, it takes hours and hours, and it's really cumbersome. And this is something you might do, once a year for a special event, maybe like a wedding or, Christmas or something like that. But this isn't something you're going to do every single day of your life. It's just too hard. So then they ask the question, what is something that users do every single day? Well, the opinion of this small executive team is music. The new version of Steve Jobs agrees, doesn't try to force iMovie down people's throats. He agrees. He's not trying to be the superhero. He's not trying to put his massive ego on display, saying, look at me, I'm so great. It's really a team effort. And what Steve does here is he impresses upon his team at the intersection of the arts and the technology are amazing things. He wants them to develop amazing things. Now, to get started in the music world, Steve, he was a really big fan of a company at the time called SoundJam. Their software, it was simple to navigate, and it lets you catalog all of your favorite songs. So he goes and buys the company. And he pulls a page from John D. Rockefeller's book right here. He operates SoundJam as if they had never been bought. And the employees, they're sworn to secrecy for 2 years, that no transaction had ever taken place. Rockefeller, he did this as he was buying up oil refineries. He would force them to continue operations with the same company names, with no one knowing that he owned the company. And he did this for several reasons. But mainly, he didn't want to attract attention into his rapidly growing empire, keeping copycatters out. It's the same for Steve Jobs. He felt deeply in his bones that digital online music was going to be the next big wave of the future. He wasn't wrong here. Steve takes things a step further, making it crystal clear that anyone caught leaking details of the re-engineering of SoundJam to iTunes or details of the sale would be immediately fired. A new era of Apple has arrived. All throughout the company, it becomes more and more frowned upon for designers and engineers to discuss what they're working on outside of their teams. Yet, they continue to work on iTunes. One major and simple act emerges, saying no. Steve wants simplicity. By saying no to an endless list of features, they keep the simplicity. Most people and companies, they overload products with features. As an example, I bought a Sony mirrorless camera many years ago now. The user manual was hundreds and hundreds of pages. And while I respect that, all I truly needed is the 10 or 20 page version for the common user. By saying no, Steve gets simplicity. Only the absolute most critical features, the ones that are user-friendly, got shipped. Nothing more, nothing less. In January of 2001, Steve unveils iTunes Macworld, and it's available right now and for free, and it's a quick hit with more than 275,000 downloads their very first week. Back at Apple, they start working on this tiny special computer that would hold all of your music. iPod. Johnny Ive and team, they design a new thumb wheel. And this acts in a similar manner as the scroll wheel on your computer mouse. And this really is a breakthrough that connects the user to the product. And it really makes the product feel like it's an extension of your natural body. It's the I in iPod. Jobs, he absolutely loves it. Not only do they design a product, They're designing a user experience. This is what Steve cares about more than anything in the world, the user experience, the Apple experience. Sales, they start off a bit slow. This is a $399 device, so it was a little bit expensive. But a year later, Steve, he cuts the price by $100 and they bring out a second version. And I see the iPod really as training wheels for what is about to come for Apple. It teaches them how to manufacture high quality consumer electronics at this mass scale. Plus, they adopt this mindset that with these smaller electronics, they need more frequent updates. They become a master at this. This is part of the whole Apple experience. For Jobs, the person who 20 years ago insisted on taking credit for everything, he's different. In an interview, he says the following: "Who cares where good ideas come from? If you're paying attention, you'll notice them." That line alone, right there, my friend, is worth the price of this entire book. Good ideas are always floating around us. And Steve is exactly right. Who cares where they come from? Our job is to pay attention. And when we see them, grab onto them. The dots are always there, they're hidden, like great stores are. Another piece of the Apple experience right here. Steve loved great stores. When on vacation in Italy or France, he would insist that Lorene join him in visiting Valentino, Gucci, Yves Saint Laurent, Hermes, Prada, and the like. Steve would buttonhole the sales clerks and bombard them with questions. Why had they chosen to devote so little space to their merchandise? How did the people flow through the store? He'd look at the store's interior architecture, wondering how the interplay of wood, arches, stairways, and natural and unnatural light helped set the mood that was conducive to spending outrageous sums of money. To Steve, these stores were pulling off something he had never been able to manage. They sold a lifestyle product at an absurdly high margin by presenting it in a beautiful and yet informative way. The presentation itself helped justify the higher prices a customer was asked to pay. And I just can't help to think about Sam Walton when I read that part of the book. Sam, probably the retailer of the century, he was in and out of his competitors' stores more than they were themselves. And like Walton, Jobs borrows all the best ideas for the Apple experience. First, with an online store. And the story of how this goes down is quite legendary, if you ask me. You see, Steve, he is well aware of the success Dell has selling online. So he wanted a mock-up put together of what an Apple store might look like. Eddie Q, who is one of the Apple's IT techs, he gets assigned the task. About a week later, he hands a visual presentation to Steve. Steve looks it over, hands it back, and says, "These suck." But Q, he's kind of expecting this anyways. The conversation in the room, it turns to this broader idea of selling direct online. And some people in the room, they're worried about pissing off their channel partners. And the channel partners are companies like Best Buy or CompUSA, those that they were selling through. Well, if we dive into the book here. Finally, one of the senior guys opposing the idea spoke up. "Steve," he asked, "isn't all this pointless? You're not going to do this. The channel will hate it." Q, who didn't know any better, turned to him immediately. "The channel?" he exclaimed. "We lost $2 billion last year. Who gives a fuck about the channel?" Steve perked up. "You," he said, pointing to the senior exec, "you were wrong. And you," he continued looking at Q, "are right." By the end of the meeting, he had asked Q and O'Connor to create an online store where buyers could customize their purchases and have it completed in 2 months. Mad respect for Q, speaking his mind right there. When you have the truth at your back, you might as well put all of your cards on the table. Again, just mad respect for Q. And how does it pay off? Quite well, I must say. The online store went up April 28th, 1998. As Q prepared to drive home that evening, he walked past Steve's office to tell him they had sold more than $1 million worth of computers in just 6 hours. That's great, said Steve. Imagine what we could do if we had real stores. Nothing could ever be enough, Q realized. He liked the challenge. Steve is always looking forward. He doesn't celebrate, he looks forward. Once the dot's connected, there's no time to look at it because the next one is waiting to be found, which takes place in a warehouse Apple had rented in 2000. Inside, there's a team of designers. They spend months going through several prototypes of the Apple Store. Steve, using his experience from those great stores in London and Italy, pushes for a minimalist, clean feel, a store that has easy navigation around their tables with merchandise displayed in a simple manner. The first stores, they open May of 2001 in Virginia and California. The stores, they start off decent, well enough, I guess, but as described in the book, they just become a haven for this older generation that really loves Apple and doesn't mind paying these higher prices. The salespeople that are put in the stores, they're paid a salary, they're not commission-based, and they're highly trained. So you could actually go to the Apple Store and get help or get valuable insights about your Apple products from employees that were trained and employees that cared. Apple, they study traffic patterns. They're very keen and they're very wise about this. And what they start to do is they start to beef up the store with more affordable products like iTunes, iPod, and later on iPad and iPhone. The Apple Store, it starts to become this really cool place for Generation X and Generation Y because they can go and purchase those more affordable products. Momentum goes up, and so do the new stores. Slowly but steadily, over the years, the stores would become the most successful retail outlets in the world when measured by sales per square foot. The Apple experience becomes deeper and deeper ingrained in our modern culture. For years, Microsoft had been developing software that could be run on Apple. Steve, he turns the tables. In 2003, he announces during a presentation that Apple is now offering iTunes for Windows. And I love this. On the slide, it says, "Hell froze over." I was really cracking up when I read that. It made me smile. Within 3 days, 1 million PCs download iTunes and start purchasing music. The Apple experience is now infecting Windows users. He's pulling in more and more people to the Apple experience. Now, right around this time, doctors, they find a rare pancreatic cancer in Steve, which could be removed through an operation, which Steve delays for more than 9 months. He didn't want to do an operation if he could possibly avoid it. That was the last resort. He spends a lot of time visiting doctors all over the world. He's trying to learn about his options. He's trying to understand all of his options. Steve had been a vegan for most of his life, and he focused heavily on controlling his diet. But in the end, the only clear choice that he could see was surgery. So in July of 2004, doctors go in and remove the tumor on his pancreas, and the recovery is just brutal. And we get to see Steve's innate, deeply driven nature put on full display right here. Steve became even more focused on work. He was doing what he loved, recalls Lorene. If anything, he doubled down. So he spent much of his 7-week convalescence thinking deeply about Apple, the computer business, the trajectory of the digital technology. He assembled an ambitious to-do list of what he wanted to accomplish once he returned to the office. When he came back from that surgery, he was on a faster clock. He only has 7 years left on Earth, and while he could never know that at the time, I do believe it feels like he knows it deep down inside. And this is where Steve Jobs becomes brilliant. He strips everything away that's not necessary at Apple or in his personal life. His focus at Apple is product development, marketing, and retail stores. Everything else, he trusts his team to handle. Outside of Apple, there's no grand social events. Steve despised those things anyways. His goal was to get home in time for family dinner. Again, Steve reminds me a lot of Jay Gould, who in the office drove with intense focus. Jay Gould was a killer in the office, but outside the office, he was a family man. He was a deep thinker and he was always looking forward towards the next dot. And for Steve, in this case, it's the iPhone. But before we get there, we have to wrap up a few loose ends over at Pixar. Steve's relationship with the Disney CEO at the time, who was Michael Eisner, was beyond repair. Call it shit. After delivering their last film to Disney, which was Monsters, Inc. in 2002, they were going to start looking for a new partner. There was going to be no more Disney. But over at Disney, there was a new CEO just stepping in, and his name was Bob Iger. One of Iger's first phone calls is to Steve, who basically acknowledges the shitty relationship that he has with Eisner. And he asks Steve to judge him based on his own merits, not the past CEO. And I think that catches Steve a little bit off guard. And he pauses and he gives it consideration. In fact, he takes a really big leap towards becoming great right here. Jobs and Iger build a mutual business friendship that's going to extend into the rest of their natural lives. They see a lot in each other. Only 4 days after Iger becomes CEO, they make a deal that allows Apple to stream Disney assets on their new video iPod. And then just a week later at Macworld, they tell everyone, and the response, well, it's overwhelming. And then the next big bomb drops right here. A couple of days after the Macworld event, Iger called Steve. I said, I've got a crazy idea. Maybe Disney should just buy Pixar outright. Steve paused and then said, that might not be the craziest idea in the world. And anyway, I like crazy ideas. Let me think about it. He called me back a couple of days later. Jobs and Iger, they see eye to eye on most things around the deal. But before the sale, Steve discusses the deal with Lasseter and Catmull. As part of the deal, they're going to run Disney Animation. But he also told them that if either one of them object, he would back out of the sale. However, he asks them to delay giving him an answer because he wants them to get to know Bob Iger. Lasseter and Catmull, they meet with Iger and they can see that he's sincere in his thinking. He's an honest man. Their response after meeting with Iger is, let's do the deal. So Disney and Pixar, they agree to a $7.4 billion price tag. We jump forward, January 24th, 2006. This is the day they're set to publicly announce and close the deal. About an hour before, Steve, he asks Iger to go for a little walk. Now Iger, his first thought here is, Steve's going to try to get out of this deal. What's up with this? And what takes place next here brought me to tears. And I just want to read it for you here. Steve led him to a bench in an isolated nook on the campus. They sat down, and there he put his arm around Iger's shoulder. And then what I'm going to read you next is Iger's reflection of what happens with Steve. And this is a little long, but there's so much goodness in here. He says, Bob, there's something really important I've got to tell you. I've got to get this off my chest with you. And it's really important as it relates to this. I ask him, what is it? He says, my cancer is back. This is January of 2006. Since the operation, there's been no hint to the outside world that he has cancer again. So, of course, I ask him to tell me more. He talks about spots on his liver, chemotherapy. I pressed him for more details. He said, I've made myself a promise that I'm going to be alive for Reed's graduation from high school. So I say, of course, how old is Reed? He tells me that Reed is 14 and will be graduating in 4 years. He says, frankly, they tell me I've got a 50-50 chance of living 5 years. Are you telling me this for any other reason than wanting to get it off your chest? I asked. He says, I'm telling you because I'm giving you a chance to back out of the deal. So I look at my watch and we've got 30 minutes. In 30 minutes, we're going to make this announcement. We've got television crews. We've got board votes. We've got investment bankers. The wheels are turning. And I'm thinking, we're in a post-Sarbanes-Oxley world in Enron and fiduciary responsibility. And he is going to be our largest shareholder. And I'm now being asked to bury a secret. He told me only 2 other people knew this, Lorene and his doctor. And he told me, my kids don't even know. Not even the Apple board knows. Nobody knows and you can't tell anybody. Basically, thanks. I have to make a decision sitting on this bench with him whether I can even go through with this deal. I don't even know. So I took a chance and I said, you're our largest shareholder, but I don't think that makes this matter. You're not material to the deal. We're buying Pixar. We're not buying you. We're going to hype the fact that you become the largest shareholder, but that's not how you value the deal. You value the deal on the assets of Pixar. So we announced the deal. That's heavy stuff. Steve, he trusts Iger, gives him an out. Iger, he makes a quick decision and he moves forward and he trusts his gut. He trusts his gut and he makes the right call. It really is the gut. It's all in the gut. We have to trust our instincts, and this is how we lead in the world. Be bold, make decisions, and always move forward, like Steve does with the iPhone. And this, to tell the story properly, needs an episode all on its own. iPhone has a ton of learning lessons, and I really do hope that you can pick up this book. By the time that Steve made the call to develop iPhone, the turnaround of Apple was complete. They have a strong cult-like following of consumers who loved iTunes and iPod. Everyone wants a piece of Apple, but the linchpin is the mobile carriers. They're antiquated, and seeing outside of their 100-year-old swim lane was almost impossible unless you're Steve Jobs. And what he was able to demonstrate to AT&T was that the new devices that they were developing are going to stream everything over the internet. Movies, photos, phone calls, text messages. And what do all of those things need? Data. Lots and lots of data. Who moves data? AT&T moves data. So they let their brick wall down and they agree to let Apple build their own phone and their own user interface for that phone. In exchange, they're going to be the exclusive carrier of the iPhone. In the first 3 months, they sell 1.5 million phones. At the time this book was released, 2014, 2015 timeframe, Apple had sold over 500 million iPhones all over the world. For Steve, his health keeps going downhill. In 2009, he flies to Memphis for a liver transplant, and after 2 months of a long recovery, Steve, in his hard-driving fashion, he returns to Apple. Mostly he's working from home at this time, and he had clearly lost a lot of weight, and he's looking very frail. They launched the iPad, which becomes the fastest-selling Apple product ever, selling 15 million units in the first year alone. As Steve enters the last few months of life, he draws closer to a select few close friends, Bob Iger, Ed Catmull, Johnny Ives, John Lasseter, and of course his family and the company he loves. At Apple, Steve still did everything he could to have people treat him as if he were not sick. He was working his ass off until the end, in pain, remembers Eddie Q. You could see it in the meetings. He was taking morphine, and you could see he was in pain, but he was still interested. Up until his last days, he was fully dedicated, talking to his team about new ideas, about new marketing strategies, and he was always looking towards the future. Steve, he passes away October 5th, 2011. At one of his memorial services, Johnny Ives says the following about Steve. Steve loved ideas and loved making stuff, and he treated the process of creativity with a rare and wonderful reverence. He, better than anyone, understood that while ideas ultimately can be so powerful, they begin as fragile, barely formed thoughts, so easily missed, so easily compromised, so easily squished. His was a victory for beauty, for purity, and, as he would say, for giving a damn. Giving a damn. That's what made Steve Jobs an asshole. A deep, caring friend, a clear thinker, someone who wants to know why, and all for the love of Apple. My deepest thanks to the authors for this amazing book. I've listened to 20 or more podcasts on Steve Jobs, as I had mentioned earlier, and it really felt like I had a good idea about who he was. Those are minor blips on the radar. This podcast episode, possibly also just a minor blip. But for me, the book, it gives me new appreciation for Steve. And while I'll never fully understand the true man that was Steve Jobs, I can at least feel part of his spirit as I'm reading this book. And as I work on crafting an outline and recording and delivering this podcast, it just helps me know him a little bit more. I really do hope that you've enjoyed this episode and can take some lessons away that will help you in your business or your life. The book is amazing. Please pick up a copy. There's no way that I could cover even a fraction of what's in the book. Before we close down the show, I just wanted to leave you with one final thought about Steve Jobs, as described by author Jim Collins. What separates people is the return on luck, what you do with it when you get it. What matters is how you play the hand you're dealt. He continues, you don't leave the game until it's not your choice. Steve Jobs had great luck at arriving at the birth of an industry. Then he had bad luck in getting booted out. But Steve played whatever hand he was dealt to the best of his ability. Sometimes you create the hand by giving yourself challenges that will make you stronger. Until next time, my friend, make it a beautiful day in the neighborhood.